Have you ever stopped to think that you might be part of one of the last moments in human history when there are still people alive who remember what life was like before smartphones, before the internet, before our existence became completely intertwined with algorithms and screens? There's a strange melancholy in realizing that at this exact moment, as you hear these words, you're witnessing the silent end of something that humanity has carried for thousands of years, the living memory of a purely analog existence, where boredom was possible, where silence didn't need to be filled, where anxiety had defined temporal limits because there was no possibility of being always connected, always available, always being bombarded by information. This isn't just a nostalgic reflection on times past, but an urgent investigation into what we're losing without even noticing and why it matters more than we imagine. Consider for a moment your grandmother or grandfather, if they're still alive, or think about the elderly people you know. They carry in their minds something that will soon be completely extinct. The bodily, emotional, and cognitive memory of what it was like to live in a world where human attention was not a commercialized product, where relationships were not mediated by digital interfaces, where knowledge had weight and scarcity, where time passed in a fundamentally different way. When they were young, a letter took days or weeks to reach its recipient. And this delay wasn't seen as a technical problem to be solved, but simply as the temporal nature of human communication. When they wanted to know something, they had to go to a library, search through books, ask people, and often the answer simply wasn't available. And this was accepted as a normal part of the human condition. We're going through a historical transition comparable only to humanity's great revolutions. The agricultural revolution that took us from nomadic life, the industrial revolution that took us from the countryside to cities, and now the digital revolution that is taking us from physical reality to a hybrid reality where our experience is constantly filtered, optimized, and commodified by algorithms. But unlike previous transitions, which took centuries or at least decades to complete, this one is happening at the speed of 1 or 2 generations. In just 20 years, we've gone from a world where most human experience happened offline to a world where practically every significant experience has some digital component. What makes this transition particularly disturbing is that it's not being driven by fundamental human needs, but by economic and technological imperatives that operate according to their own logic, often contrary to human welfare. The attention economy has transformed our capacity for focus into a resource to be extracted, similar to how the Industrial Revolution transformed natural resources into commodities. Our minds have become territories to be colonized by corporations that have developed more sophisticated technologies to capture and maintain our attention than any propaganda or social control system that has ever existed in human history. The generation that still remembers what it was like to live before this mental colonization is literally dying. When the last person who lived their entire youth without the internet dies, something irretrievable will be lost forever. Not just information or customs, but a form of consciousness, a quality of experience that cannot be documented in books or videos because it is fundamentally experiential. It's like trying to explain to someone who has never experienced silence what true silence is like, or trying to describe to someone who has always had access to GPS what it meant to get truly lost, having to trust your own intuition and the kindness of strangers to find your way. Think about the last time you were truly bored. Not that modern boredom that is immediately interrupted by checking your phone, but deep contemplative boredom that forces the mind to wander down unprogrammed paths, that creates space for genuinely original thoughts to emerge from nothing. The previous generation knew this kind of boredom as a regular, almost daily experience. They knew what it meant to spend hours waiting in line with nothing to do but observe other people and let their minds wander. They knew what it was to have a conversation that started without a specific purpose and extended for hours, without interruptions, without the anxiety of missing something important happening online. This loss is not merely sentimental. There is growing scientific evidence that the type of cognition we develop when we are not constantly stimulated by external inputs is fundamentally different and potentially superior in many ways to the type of cognition we develop in digitally hyper-stimulated environments. The capacity for sustained attention, the ability to enter deep flow states, the capacity to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty without immediately seeking external answers, the ability to form lasting and meaningful memories, all these cognitive capacities seem to be atrophying in populations that grew up entirely in digital environments. But what's even more concerning is that we're losing not just individual cognitive capacities, but also forms of sociability and intimacy that took thousands of years to develop. The previous generation knew how to be present with another person in a way that has become almost impossible for us. They knew how to have conversations that weren't performed for imaginary audiences, how to develop relationships that didn't leave digital traces, how to keep aspects of their lives genuinely private, not because they were hiding something, but because privacy was seen as a necessary condition for developing a rich and authentic inner life. When this generation completely disappears, we will live in a world where no one alive will be able to remember what human experience was like before it was optimized, quantified, and monetized. It will be like living in a city where all the old buildings have been demolished and replaced by modern constructions. We lose the ability to imagine what the previous architecture was like because there's no longer a physical reference to it, except that, in this case, it's not buildings being demolished, but forms of consciousness, patterns of attention, qualities of experience that once defined what it meant to be human. We can already see the first symptoms of this loss in younger generations who demonstrate levels of anxiety, depression, and difficulty concentrating unprecedented in human history. But instead of questioning whether there's a connection between these symptoms and the digital environment in which these generations grew up, the predominant response has been to develop more technology to solve the problems created by technology. Meditation apps to combat anxiety caused by other apps. Digital productivity tools to help with lack of focus caused by other digital tools. Online mental health platforms to treat depression caused, in part, by social isolation, facilitated by other online platforms. This is a particularly modern form of insanity, using the same tools that created a problem to try to solve the problem, instead of questioning whether the tools themselves might be the problem. It's like trying to cure food poisoning by eating more of the same food that caused the poisoning, but in smaller portions and at more regulated times. The logic seems sensible on the surface, but completely ignores the possibility that the real solution is to stop consuming the toxic substance. The tragedy is that many of the people making decisions about how technology should be developed and implemented have no personal memory of what life was like before these technologies. They genuinely cannot imagine that there are ways to organize society and human experience that don't depend on constant digital optimization. For them, the idea of living without smartphones or internet is not an option to be considered, but a primitive impossibility, like suggesting we return to living in caves. But the generation that still remembers offers a crucial perspective. They know it's possible to be happy, productive, and connected with other human beings without depending on technologies that monetize our attention. They lived that reality. They know that deep and lasting relationships can be formed without dating apps. They know it's possible to learn new and interesting things without algorithms personalizing our educational experience. They know it's possible to be entertained without streaming platforms fed by behavioral data. They know it's possible to work efficiently without tools that monitor every click and every eye movement. This is not an argument for returning to an idealized past, but a call for us to recognize what we're losing before it's too late. There are aspects of modern life that are genuinely superior to the past. We have access to information and educational opportunities that previous generations couldn't even dream of. We have global communication capabilities that can facilitate forms of collaboration and mutual understanding without precedent. We have tools that can help solve complex problems and improve the quality of life for billions of people. The problem is not technology itself, but our inability to use these tools consciously and intentionally. Instead of allowing technology to shape our lives according to its own logic, we need to develop the wisdom to decide when and how to use these tools in ways that genuinely serve our deepest interests and values. And this wisdom can only come from a clear understanding of what life was like before these technologies, what options exist beyond them, and what types of human experience we're willing to sacrifice in the name of efficiency and connectivity. The urgency of this issue cannot be underestimated. Each year that passes, we lose more people who carried this alternative memory of human experience. With each generation born entirely immersed in digital environments, it becomes harder to imagine that there are other ways to organize consciousness and society. Soon, we will reach a point where humanity will have completely forgotten what it was like to live in a purely analog way. And at that moment, certain options will become literally unthinkable. It's fascinating and terrifying to realize that we're living through a transformation so fundamental to the human condition that future generations might look back and see our era as the moment when humanity split into two species, analog Homo sapiens and digital Homo sapiens. And the transition between these two species is happening not through slow biological evolution, but through behavioral and cognitive changes that can be implemented in a matter of years or even months. I want to pause for a moment to ask you directly, when was the last time you spent an entire day without checking any digital device? When was the last time you had a deep conversation with someone without either of you consulting a phone during the conversation? When was the last time you allowed yourself to get truly lost without GPS and had to figure out the way using only your own navigation skills and the help of other people? If these experiences seem strange or unnecessarily difficult, perhaps that's a sign of how deeply we've already been transformed by technologies we didn't always consciously choose to adopt. And if you recognize this sense of loss, if you feel that something important has been sacrificed in the name of convenience and connectivity, share in the comments, I feel we lost some essence of human life when we stopped. Your reflection can help other people name something that many of us feel but rarely discuss openly. The implications of this transition go far beyond individual personal experiences. We're witnessing the end of forms of knowledge that cannot be digitized because they depend on bodily experience, intuition developed over decades, and types of wisdom that can only be transmitted through prolonged coexistence between generations. The farmer who knows when to plant by observing subtle signs in animal behavior and almost imperceptible changes in the quality of light. The craftsman who has developed tactile sensitivity sufficient to feel differences in material texture that no digital sensor can detect. The grandmother who knows if a child is really sick or just wanting attention based on decades of experience observing human behavior. This kind of embodied knowledge is being rapidly replaced by algorithms and sensors that may be more precise in many cases, but that operate according to a completely different logic. An algorithm can be programmed to recognize patterns, but cannot develop intuition. An artificial intelligence can process large amounts of data about human behavior, but cannot develop genuine empathy based on lived experience. A sensor can measure temperature and humidity accurately, but cannot feel the quality of air the way someone who spent decades working outdoors can feel. When the last generation that developed these kinds of non-digitized sensitivities disappears, we will lose not just specific knowledge, but entire ways of relating to the world that took thousands of years to develop. And it's not clear if it will be possible to recover these capacities once they're lost, because they depend on types of experience and practice that have become increasingly rare in digitally mediated environments. What makes this situation particularly ironic is that at the same time we're losing these traditional forms of knowledge, we're developing incredibly sophisticated technologies to preserve information. We can digitize entire libraries, create video archives of practically any event, record conversations with perfect audio quality. But lived experience cannot be archived. The quality of attention that someone develops by spending hours observing clouds cannot be transferred through time-lapse videos of cloud formations. The patience that someone develops waiting for a plant to grow cannot be simulated through digital gardening games. This is one of the great illusions of our era. The belief that we can preserve everything that matters through digital documentation. But there are aspects of human experience that simply cannot be translated into digital formats because they fundamentally depend on temporalities, rhythms, and qualities of attention that are incompatible with digital logic. And when we lose access to these experiences, we also lose parts of ourselves that we didn't know were important until they no longer exist. Imagine trying to explain to someone who has never experienced true rural silence what it means to be in a place where the only sounds are natural: wind in trees, flowing water, occasionally a bird or wild animal. Not just the absence of urban noise, but the presence of a specific quality of silence that has density, texture, that produces a specific type of mental calm that cannot be replicated through white noise apps or digitally reproduced nature sounds. This kind of silence is becoming increasingly rare, not just because there are fewer and fewer genuinely quiet places, but because we've developed an anxiety about silence that makes us automatically feel any pause with digital stimulation. The generation that remembers what it was like to live with this kind of regular silence carries something that cannot be taught, only lived. And when they die, they will take with them not just memories, but a way of being in the world that may not be recoverable through artificial recreation. It's possible that future generations will develop healthy relationships with silence and boredom, but they will probably be